Arm length is one of the biggest concerns about potential Jets offensive line prospect Peter Skoronski in the upcoming NFL draft. But I think these concerns are overrated, and I'll explain why on today's episode of the Locked On Jets podcast.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, this is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, April 17th, 2023, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com, thanking you for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Subscribe to this podcast for free on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts so that you'll get new episodes as soon as they're posted. If you're listening on a podcast source and enjoy it, please give the show a 5-star review, and if you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help Locked On Jets out and help other Jets fans find us. Today, our episode is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. Ever dreamed of becoming an NFL GM and managing your football franchise? Then this game is definitely for you. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up on the app stores. And our listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDON, all caps, in the game. Let's talk about the NFL draft, and let's talk about the tackle position in particular. We have not done enough on the NFL draft, and believe it or not, it's next week. Next Thursday through Saturday, the NFL draft is upcoming. It feels like it's kind of snuck up on us. At least that's the way it feels to me. And I think part of this has been kind of a strange offseason for the Jets, where so much focus has been on a trade that hasn't happened yet, Aaron Rodgers. And honestly, I'm tired of talking about Aaron Rodgers. We've talked about Aaron Rodgers for like the last month and a half. Let's focus on the draft. And the tackle position in particular is interesting because, first of all, the Jets have a need there. I mean, I don't care what you tell me. I don't care what the Jets tell me. They can't be happy with what they got there. I mean, I understand Dwayne Brown played reasonably well for them, at least as well as you could expect a late signing who's in his late 30s, a guy that got, after training camp began, kind of an emergency signing. But let's be honest, Dwayne Brown's near the end of his career, and he was not healthy last year. It's going to be a lot to ask 17 good games out of him. It's also going to be a lot to ask anything out of Mekhi Becton this year. Becton's essentially missed 2 full seasons. And I think one of the things we forget about a player like Becton is it can impact his development. He pretty much missed 2 developmental years, 2 years where he could have been working on his technique, which was something he needed when the Jets drafted him out of Louisville, have been spent rehabbing injuries. It's a lot. And right now, I know the Jets also have Max Mitchell, who's I view as a wild card. It's one thing to draft a tackle, have somebody step in and I guess play right tackle this year. And then between Brown, Becton, and Mitchell, you can figure out how to get 17 games out of the trio. That's very different from needing 2 of the 3 to hold up over the course of a full season. So tackle's an important spot for the Jets, and we've discussed it. Again, I said I didn't want to discuss Rodgers today because we've talked about him from every angle conceivable, but I guess it is worth mentioning. He's a 39 to 40-year-old quarterback. You want to protect him with diminishing mobility. So putting a line in front of him is going to be very important. So I want to talk about 3 prospects who could be available for the Jets at 13. And we're assuming the Jets hold on to 13. We're assuming that does not go to Green Bay. And I feel like this could be a spot where need lines up with where the Jets pick, because 13 could be the sweet spot for tackle this year. And it's frustrating because the Jets have already spent 2 first-round picks on offensive linemen in the last 3 years, but because of Becton's failures, they may have to go again at the offensive line spots. Now, the first guy I'm going to talk about is Peter Skoronski out of Northwestern. Now, this is an interesting prospect because he's about as polished of an offensive line prospect as you'll see. He is, to the extent there's a plug-and-play guy in this year's draft class of the offensive line, it's Peter Skoronski. And he has everything you want in a tackle prospect except one thing. His arms are really short. Typically they say you want, and ideally, a tackle to have about 34-inch arms. Skoronski's arms are just about 32 inches, 32 and a quarter. Why is arm length important? Well, it depends on who you ask. A lot of people would tell you that at the tackle position, you're going up against explosive athletes. So what you want somebody with long arms who can stick them out and stonewall the edge rusher. Essentially use your arms to slow down the edge rusher's momentum. And if you don't touch the edge rusher far enough away from you, then the edge rusher may get up on you. He may get leverage on you. So you want to be able to contact him when he's far away from you. So that's why it's viewed as important. Now, it's worth noting that Joe Thomas did not have 34-inch arms. Joe Thomas was the best tackle of his generation. So that's, it's one of those things where I feel like sometimes it can be a little overblown. But Skoronski has everything else. I mean, he's a technician. He's got nimble feet. I think he plays with pretty good power. I really like him as a prospect. I think he's as polished of a prospect as they come. And one of the reasons I brought up Joe Thomas is, first of all, he was the best tackle of his era. There's no question about it. He had shorter arms than was ideal. Now, his arms were longer than Skoronski's, but I understand. In theory, you want longer arms because, again, you don't want an edge rusher to be able to make contact close enough to you where he can get leverage. You also don't want to be in a situation that to make contact with an edge rusher, you have to lean forward, because when you lean forward, you get yourself off balance, and that puts you in a really bad spot. But Skoronski said at the Combine that the reason arm length is overrated, he was defending himself. He said the reason arm length is overrated is that it's used as an excuse for bad technique. Essentially, what he says is that guys who have short arms don't fail because they have short arms. It's because they have bad technique. And that if you use your arms more effectively, it doesn't matter how long they are. Now, there's not really been a tackle with arms as short as him that succeeded in the NFL. But I think it's an interesting point. And, I think sometimes we overstate flaws. And I think that this is part of my theory that maybe there's a little too much content out there. I think especially in the draft community, players get overanalyzed. People look at these guys for every single angle, and they find ways to pick players apart. And sometimes it's not fair. And, we're okay with this at certain positions. Like at the wide receiver position, if somebody lacks ideal size, we figure out how they can make up for that. We understand that if you lack ideal size, well, maybe you're quick, maybe you're twitchy, maybe you can create separation that way, so you don't need to win jump balls. But at other spots, like a lack of physical tools, we view as kind of something that will prevent you from being a good player, and it's not always fair. And I think what Skoronski's point is that maybe the margin for error is lower when you have shorter arms, but if you use your arms efficiently, if you use proper technique, that makes up for a lack of length in your arms. Whereas a guy with longer arms maybe doesn't need to be quite as technically precise because he can still reach out. Maybe if it's inefficient, he can keep the guy away from him. But it's not necessarily something that's going to make you a good player. Long arms won't make you a good player if you lack technique. And if you have great technique, you can make up for a lack of length. And Joe Thomas himself pretty much said that I'm not allowed to use the phrase, you can look up the tweet, but Joe Thomas essentially said the way arm length is measured we'll substitute the word he used because I'm not allowed to say it, it's nonsense. And when I think this through, if Skoronski's there at 13, I played the Jets GM in 2 mock drafts that I've done with the organizations that I cover the Jets for. Skoronski's been on the board both times. I have not hesitated to pick him. And I think this through, and it varies what I focus on from year to year, but the Garrett Wilson experience at wide receiver has kind of weighed on my mind. And why do I say that? I know it's a different position. It's not wide receiver. It's offensive line. But the reason I say Garrett Wilson weighs on my mind is sometimes it's simple enough as if a guy knows how to play effectively, that's the guy you take. It can be that simple. And I think sometimes we get a little too crazy about ceiling in the first round. We talk about a guy's hypothetical ceiling. Like 3 years ago, Mekhi Becton had the higher ceiling than Tristan Wirfs. Well, Tristan Wirfs was an all-pro. So we talk about ceiling. I mean, Tristan Wirfs' ceiling was pretty good. When we're talking drafting guys in the top half of the first round, everybody's got a high ceiling. One guy's ceiling might be slightly higher than somebody else's, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. It's not necessarily like you're taking a low ceiling player. And Skoronski, for me, he's a guy who, even if the arm thing becomes an issue, and I'm not sure it will be, he's a plug-and-play guy at guard. And, I hear people say, well, the Jets don't need a guard. And when I think that through, I say, is Laken Tomlinson a guy we're expecting to be here after this year? Is Laken Tomlinson a long-term player for the Jets? So even if you draft Skoronski, and I think you play him at tackle until he proves he can't play there, let's say he fails at tackle. Fine, you slide him in guard next year, and then you lock guard down for the next 10 to 12 years, or maybe not 12 years, but lock guard down for the next 6 to 8 years with him and Elijah Vera Tucker. I mean, I think this would be a really good pick. I like him a lot. No, there's no guarantee players, but there's never a guarantee when you're talking about the draft. But when you get a guy who knows how to play, a guy who knows how to use technique, for me, that's a big deal, especially when he's got talent to be picked in the top of the first round. So Peter Skoronski, that's a guy who interests me a lot. And if he's on the board, it's a guy I would like to see the Jets pick. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll continue our discussion of offensive line prospects. We'll move to Ohio State. Paris Johnson, interesting candidate, interesting prospect. We'll discuss him as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Ultimate Football GM. We're kind of playing mock Jets GM today as we talk about potential tackles the Jets could look at 13. And you've heard me talk about this mobile game before. If you want to try out being a good GM, you got to give this game a try. It's not as easy as you might think to create a dynasty, because when you play Ultimate Football GM, you get to control and manage every strategic aspect of your team as you play through seasons and lead your team to glory trying to build a historic dynasty. With Ultimate Football GM, you are responsible for controlling the destiny of your franchise by hiring the right coaches and coordinators, managing all the finances, including negotiating player salary and terms, and navigating your franchise through free agency, the draft, injuries, player personnel issues, and all the ups and downs of a season. And all of this comes in a challenging and realistic game world. Ultimate Football GM is completely free and playable offline. Play on the go as you want and when you want to. And Locked On Jets listeners get a 100% free boost to their franchise when using promo code LOCKEDON, all caps, in the game store. Again, that's Locked On in all caps, so make sure to check it out today. To download the game, just visit ultimate-gm.com or look it up in the app stores. That's ultimate-gm.com. Ultimate Football GM. Start your dynasty today. Thank you for making Locked On Jets your first listen or first watch every day. We're talking offensive line prospects, particularly tackle prospects who could interest the Jets with the 13th overall pick. Jets got a great player last year from Ohio State at 10 in Garrett Wilson. Could this be the second straight year the Jets draft an offensive player from Ohio State in the first round? Well, there's a tackle prospect out there who could intrigue them, and that's Paris Johnson, who played at Ohio State. Now, this guy kind of has the physical tools you're looking for. I mentioned Peter Skoronski. He's got all the tools you want, except maybe the arm length. And if Peter Skoronski had longer arms, he'd be a guy who would probably be a top 5 pick. Paris Johnson has all the tools you want, and beyond that, he's got a frame that could fill out a little bit. So what I talked about with Skoronski is just a technician. He knows how to play the game, and he's got, again, outside of the arm length, he's got everything you need. Paris Johnson is a guy who's, I don't want to say he's a project, because he's not. He goes out there and I think he had a pretty effective year blocking for Ohio State, but he's less consistent than Skoronski. So this is going to be a guy that you'd have to coach up. So that's what we might call a Keith Carter special. Keith Carter is the Jets' new offensive line coach. So this is one where I feel like if you draft Paris Johnson, this is the type of guy your offensive line coach has to buy into. And, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. You've seen it through the years with the Jets. Sometimes they'll draft an offensive line prospect who's viewed as a project, and, it doesn't really work out that well. Paris Johnson's not necessarily a project, and you see flashes of dominance. And you saw him have a pretty productive season at Ohio State. He's got the nimble feet that you look for in a tackle prospect. You got to have good feet as a tackle. As silly as it sounds, and somebody may, whenever I say that, somebody makes a sarcastic comment about how this isn't ballet, this is football. But you got to think about what playing tackle in the NFL means. You're out one-on-one on an island essentially on most plays, and sometimes you're facing some of the most dynamic athletes in the world, edge rushers in the NFL, especially the elite guys in this league. And that means you have to be very nimble. Why do you have to be nimble? Because they're attacking. On a lot of these plays, you have to backpedal. You have to backpedal, so your momentum's taking you back. Your momentum's essentially taking you the opposite direction of where you want to go, because you want to be attacking. You'd rather attack on the offensive line. But when you are pass blocking, you're essentially going backward, and you have one of the most dynamic athletes in the league charging at you. So you got to have pretty good feet, because then you have to set, and you have to figure out a way to get leverage on them. Now, Johnson, I think, has longer arms than Skoronski. It's just a matter of inconsistency with him. You'll see a tendency there to do what's known as oversetting. And what's that? Well, you want to make sure that you don't get out too wide. Because and you can just think this through, you don't necessarily need to watch a lot of film to understand what I'm saying. You're kind of trying to go to a spot where as much as anything, you're trying to predict where the other guy's going to go. If you get out too wide, you leave yourself susceptible to an inside move. So you have to kind of hit the middle of the strike zone, so to speak. You have to be kind of in the middle of where the guy is. You don't want him to get an inside path to your quarterback. You don't want to allow him to get an outside path to your quarterback, though. But in my book, oversetting is a bigger sin than not going wide enough, because at least if you don't go wide enough, the guy has to go around you to the outside, so he has a longer path to the quarterback. Whereas if you allow the inside path to the quarterback, I mean, that's a direct route to your quarterback. So that's something you want to avoid, and it's a tendency that he has that just happens a little bit too much. I think hand placement's also inconsistent. You want to make sure you hit him in the strike zone. There's a certain spot you want to be able to get leverage on him. And I think sometimes he's a little bit, he misses on his hand punches. It's just a matter, and this is not a surprise. It's not a huge knock on him. He's a young player. And one of the challenges when you're dealing with college prospects is there is a limit to the amount of practice time college players get. So, sometimes you'll hear criticism about certain college coaches that they don't develop players very well. But you have to remember, they don't get the same amount of time with their prospects as NFL players do. There's a limit to the amount of practice time college players get. Those are rules the NCAA has. So there are not a lot of finished products who enter the NFL. And that's, those guys usually go pretty high in the draft. And those guys go probably higher than 13. Every player you draft is going to have some degree of question marks around them. They're going to have some degree of, where you have a weakness that you need to develop. And that's one of the things that makes scouting the draft so difficult. When a guy fails, everybody points back to the weaknesses that were on the scouting report. Well, of course, every prospect has issues. There's very few finished prospects, and if they are finished, they go in the top 5. It's a question of whether you can work through those issues. So those are the two that I see for Paris Johnson. I think his feet are a little inconsistent. I think his hands are a little inconsistent. But you see that he's got the frame you want. He's got the athleticism you want. And if he can work through these things, and again, it may not happen. There may be a little inconsistency as a rookie. But if he can work through these things, he's got everything, and he can fill out his frame a little bit more. He can get bigger, so he could be the type of guy, your prototypical tackle prospect in this league, a guy who, I would probably rate behind Skoronski right now, but I don't think he would necessarily be a bad pick for the Jets. Now, there's one more player we're going to discuss today. This is a guy who's a little bit more of a wild card because he doesn't have a ton of playing experience. We're going to talk Broderick Jones of Georgia as we continue this Monday episode of the Locked On Jets podcast. This is the Locked On Jets podcast. Here on this Monday, we're talking potential offensive line prospects who could interest the Jets with the 13th overall pick. We're assuming they keep the pick. They better keep the pick. And if they don't keep this pick, it better be for a trade back. This pick better not go to Green Bay for Aaron Rodgers. I'll say that right now. In part because the Jets need to continue adding premium young talent. They did a great job in last year's draft. They added 2 rookies of the year, a third guy who could have been rookie of the year. They added some guys who looked like promising youngsters. When you're talking about Michael Clemens, Jermaine Johnson, guys who can help the team on the offensive line at least as rotational players going forward. Lots to love about that 22 class. Let's keep it going in 23. Now, there's a guy who's kind of a wild card out there, and that's Broderick Jones of Georgia. And the reason he's a wild card is that he doesn't have a ton of playing experience. He has less than 2 full years of starting experience. He played tackle for Georgia this year. That's going to be the question mark with him. And the issue is that he just doesn't have a ton of film on him. And it's always a bit of a risk. But I think that, it's easy to write a guy off because he doesn't have a ton of college experience. There's a difference between playing well in college and playing well in the NFL. And beyond that, just because you don't have a ton of college experience, that doesn't necessarily equate to failure in the NFL. And I think this is a mistake people make a lot of times. Sometimes we make it with free agents where we assume just because a guy hasn't done something that he's incapable of doing something. Now, the thing with Broderick Jones is, I think when you're talking offensive line prospects, there's one thing that can make up for a lot of sins, and that's playing with the quote-unquote nasty streak. This guy likes to punish defenders. I mean, this guy, he is physical. He moves people. And he's got a kind of a frame where he can grow. He can add some bulk, I think. He's 6'5". He's only like 310 or so. So this is a guy who can add some weight to the frame. But when we talk about that lack of experience, I mean, I talked about Paris Johnson being a bit of an unfinished product. Broderick Jones, I mean, he needs even more work. I mean, you just see it. I mean, there's some really sloppy technique. You see that from time to time. And the reason I think the lack of game reps hurt him, I don't think it's necessarily a deal breaker, but game situations are where you develop. That's the best spot where you learn your craft, where you develop. And I think the lack of technique, that kind of shows up there. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean it's a deal breaker. He can learn. Guys, no player is a finished product when they enter the NFL. So there's plenty of time for him to learn. And sometimes guys pick up things quicker than you'd expect. Sometimes a guy enters and you think he's a project. Now, this is a guy I would characterize as a little bit more of a project than even Paris Johnson. But sometimes guys just pick things up, and sometimes it's about that NFL level coaching, and more than the quality overall, because I think, in college, especially at Georgia, you have very high caliber coaches. It's about the time. It's about the fact that you get to work on it nonstop. You don't have to worry about going to class. You can actually work with your coaches all day. There are no limits to the amount of time your coaches can work with you. So sometimes we say a guy needs to sit a year or two. That's not always, sometimes that's true, but it's not always the case. And I think that when we say, oh, this guy's got to sit 1 year, this guy's got to sit 2 years, that's a little arbitrary because players learn at different speeds. Now, I think that this would be a higher risk move. I think certainly we're talking Broderick Jones. This would be a move where the bust, the failure rate is probably much higher than it is with a Skoronski. And, I think ceiling versus floor, that's always the debate. But like I said, I like a guy who knows how to play, especially at 13. That said, it's about whether or not you hit. And there are plenty of players who barely saw playing time in college who ended up being great. Rob Gronkowski missed his last season of college because he had an injury. Antonio Cromartie did not play his final season of college because he had an injury. Broderick Jones did play his final season of college. And he flashed that ability. He moves people. Now, again, he's inconsistent. The hands miss. Sometimes he's a guy who doesn't use his feet all that well. He's a guy who likes to lunge a little bit, which you don't love, because when you lunge, when you're leaning forward, you're off balance, and it makes it easier, especially when you're in the NFL, for a guy to just kind of throw you away. You want to maintain leverage in the NFL. You can get away with leaning a little bit in college because sometimes you're just so much bigger than the other guy that it doesn't matter. The NFL, everybody's really good. It's an important thing to remember in the NFL, even the bad players. I'm as guilty of this as anybody, where I say, this guy's not any good. That's not true. Everybody in the NFL is good. And some guys obviously have more talent than others. Guy with talent and good technique will beat guy with less talent and good technique. Guy with more talent and bad technique loses to guy with less talent and good technique. So it's something Broderick Jones is going to have to learn. I think it's a riskier pick, so to speak, than Skoronski or even a Johnson. I think that the rate of a miss here would be higher, but you got the tools. He clearly has the physical tools to succeed in this league. I would rate him a little bit lower than the other guys, but I think that this is a guy where you could talk yourself into it. You could say that this could be a worthy first-round pick. And especially if Skoronski and Johnson are off the table, then perhaps this is the guy for the Jets. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you're listening on a podcast source, please give the show a 5-star review. If you're watching on YouTube, please give this episode a big thumbs up. These things help the podcast out, help other Jets fans find Locked On Jets. Have a great Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.